here at this spot, it is very important to introduce a figure that was truly bigger than life in American history. In fact, this gentleman was born a slave in Maryland. And one thing I shall have to say and point out, he actually belonged to one of my family members, and he fled and became a free man and became one of the great advocates for freedom of the slaves. And that man also was one of the great orators of his day and one of the great leaders of the black emancipation movement, as well as the movement to get equal civil rights under the law. It is my pleasure to introduce none other than Mr. Frederick Douglass.
Well, sir. I'm known as the Lion of Washington, but I have come to Kentucky. I come to Kentucky where 10,000 of my brave black men are at Camp Nelson, were at Camp Nelson, segregated in life and segregated in death. I come to Kentucky and I hear men speak of the wisdom of their mother when I was taken out of the arms of my mother when I was an infant. I come to Kentucky to hear men speak of freedom when I know too that they owned slaves. I was born a slave. The year being 1817 or 1818, and I say it thusly because it was uncommon for a slave to know his birthday, no more than you would know the birthday of a horse or a chicken or a pig. Slave owners, every ambition was to keep us ignorant. My people were kidnapped in Africa, stripped of all dignity, thrown in chains, and shipped across the middle passage of the Atlantic Ocean, where today millions of their bones lie on the ocean floor. Brought to this land where they worked, sweated, bled, and died for this country, where they were enslaved. People ask me all the time, what, Mr. Douglass, was the worst thing that you experienced during slavery? And my answer is always the same. I was taken from the arms of my mother when I was an infant. My mother was sold. I recall seeing my mother 3 or 4 times in my life, as she would work in the field in the heat, in the cold, in the rain. And when darkness would fall, she would steal away and walk all of that distance just to see her little baby, just to hold me, just to cuddle me, and just to rock me to sleep. When she never returned again, I asked my grandmother Betsy about my mother, and she would say, "Boy, your mama said they took you out of her arms, but they could never take you out of her heart." And I knew for the balance of my days that outside of the love of God, there's no love on earth greater than a mother's love. Grandmother Betsy was a strong, well-respected black woman. We lived in a tiny cabin that had a dirt floor, but I thought that cabin was a castle. And I looked up to Grandmother Betsy as if she were a queen. I did things as a little boy that perhaps you did. I played. I ran. I threw sticks and stones. I chased animals. Never caught one. One day, Grandmother Betsy came to me and said, gather up your things. We're going on a journey in the morning. Say your prayers. Grandmother Betsy prayed all the time. And she saw to it that little Frederick prayed. And after she would pray, each time she would reach out and say, hug. And she would give me the best hug. The next morning, we went on a journey. We walked and walked and walked. Soon we came upon another cabin. Around that cabin, there were little boys and girls of all colors, and all sizes and all shapes. Grandmother Betsy said, boy, go play with them. They're your kin. Now, I'd been told I had brothers and sisters, but I did not know them, and I refused to play with them. I was tired. I sat down and fell asleep, and I believe it was my brother Perry that came over and awakened me. Fred, Grandmammy's gone. And I jumped up with my heart pounding, and I looked this way, and I looked that way. And I began to call her name louder and louder, and I began to cry. And I realized the only person in the world that loved me was forced to abandon me. Grandmama Betsy. Hug. I wanted one more hug. People, that was the last day I saw my grandmother. And that was the last day of my childhood. You see, from then on, I began to learn and know what it meant to be a slave. To work in the fields, feed the animals, clean the barn, run errands, and oftentimes be beaten for little or no reason. And on that plantation, I saw horrible things that I need not mention. One day, the master came to me and said, Frederick, I'm going to send you to Baltimore, Maryland to live with my relatives. Out of all the little boys and girls on the plantation, he chose me. And I do believe to this day it was divine intervention that he did so. And you see, living in Baltimore was better than living on that old plantation. My new chore was to watch a little boy named Tommy. The master's boy. Tommy's mother was Miss Sophia, a kind white woman that would smile, and she would read the little Tommy from the Bible, and she would look down and read to me. One day she asked me, Frederick, how would you like to learn to read? You see, we couldn't go to school. They wanted to keep us ignorant. I looked up and said, yes, ma'am. And she began to teach me my ABCs every day, day in and day out, until one day the master charged into the room and pushed me down, knocked the Bible out of her hand and said, woman, don't you know if you teach that little Negro to read, he would no longer be fit to be a slave. He would teach others to read, and they would no longer be fit to be slaves. I picked myself up and I looked at old master. He didn't know that he had just given me the most valuable lesson of my life. You see, I devised many ways to learn how to read. I'd run out and find the little poor white boys in the streets, and I would take them food in exchange. They would teach me. I did this often, and eventually I could read. And I could write, and I became slave owners all over America's worst nightmare. Master found out what I was doing. He sent me away for 1 year to have my spirit broken. But after 6 months, old Edward Covey was coming at me to give me another savage beating. I closed my eyes and said, God, help me, not again, not again, please help me. And when I opened my eyes, I charged old Edward Covey, grasped him around the neck, flipped him over, and we got down. We rolled and tumbled in the dirt, and I struck him, and he began to squeal like a pig. Get him off me, get this boy off me. Sue, get him off me. Sue could have whooped both of us. She shook her head, no. Eventually, old Edward Covey fell weak, and I stood up and looked down at him, and I felt like a little boy that I read about in the Bible named David, looking down at old Goliath. That day, I felt like a man. And I swore that I would never let another man mistreat me unless he killed me. My year was up and went back. My spirit was stronger than ever. And the next thing on my agenda was running away. If a slave possessed upon his person a note of written permission, he could go visit the next plantation, or he could go into town on holidays. And since I could write, I wrote myself a pass. One for me and one for two of my slave friends. On Easter Sunday, we were going to journey into Easton. But as fate would have it, the plot was revealed to the master, and none other than one of our own kind. Master, them boys over there getting ready to run. Old Fred getting ready to run with them boys over there. So we made it into Easton all right. Tied up, drugged behind horses, and thrown in jail. Didn't know if they were going to beat us, hang us, or sell us further south into slavery. But oddly enough, Master came and retrieved us. Chewing, spitting tobacco, and reeking of corn liquor. Looking at me saying, "You old red devil, I know you're the cause of this," and he was right. But I was already planning my next getaway. This time, it was with the assistance of my sweetheart, Anna. You see, Anna was a free black woman in Baltimore. She had many talents. She worked for pay. Anna fabricated me what became my favorite color, red, a bright red sailor's uniform. A seaman uniform. I borrowed papers from a free black seaman friend of mine, and on September the 3rd, 1838, I, Frederick Douglass, escaped from slavery by train, by stagecoach, by boat. I wound up in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Met up with and married my sweetheart, Anna. Met a man named William Lloyd Garrison, the most leading abolitionist of his time. I went to a meeting on Nantucket Island. Mr. Garrison pointed me out, called me forward to tell of my life as a slave. I did so, and I was hired as a speaker on the abolition circuit. In my spare time, I wrote a book, the narrative of my life as a slave. In that book, I named the old plantation, I named Massa, I named Grandmother Betsy, my mother Harriet, and I even mentioned old Edward Covey. Mr. Garrison said, "You have now identified yourself, your location. They will come, retrieve you, take you back into slavery." They sent me to England, where for 18 months I spoke against the horrors of slavery in this country. I traveled to England, to Scotland, and to Ireland. They begged me to stay, but I said, no, I must go. They gave me $711, with which I went back to America. Some say I purchased my freedom. I prefer to say I paid ransom to that old kidnapper. Now I was free. My wife, Anna, was free, but there were 4 million slaves in this country. And I would not rest until they were all free, as I was. There was Sojourner Truth, John Brown, Dred Scott, who took his case for freedom and citizenship all the way to the Supreme Court. And Judge Taney said the Negro has never been, is not, and will never be a citizen of the United States. And I said, he who sits high and looks low has never, does not, and will never favor the oppressor. There were so many setbacks. The Missouri Compromise, the Dred Scott decision, the Fugitive Slave Act. I was beginning to question those who professed to favor freedom yet deprecated agitation. You see, there were those who wanted crops without plowing up the ground. They wanted rain without thunder and lightning. They wanted the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. I knew the struggle might be a moral one. I knew it might be a physical one. I knew it might be both moral and physical, but I knew there had to be a struggle. For you see, power concedes to nothing without a demand. It never had and it never would. We had to demand our freedom. Without a struggle, there is no progress. And finally, he came. Born a dirt poor farm boy here in Kentucky. He was a man of unblemished character. He was a lawyer in his own state. He said slavery was a moral issue and that it was wrong. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He ran for the presidency of the United States and he won. But when he won amongst loud cries of secession and rebellion from the southern states. You see, the Southerners had chosen to take their differences from the halls of diplomacy to the battlefield, thus opening their throats to the keen knife of liberty. And for those who say the cause were for states' rights, because of tariffs, I find that absurd and ludicrous. Their cause was solely this: to maintain and expand their right to own another man. And when that first cannonball shattered the walls of Fort Sumter, I, Frederick Douglass, said the war would not be fought entirely by white men. For a war undertaken and brazenly carried out for the perpetual enslavement of black men logically and loudly called for colored men to suppress it. The North was on its heels, and the generals were pleading for men, more men. We need men. And I asked them, why would you fight the rebels with one hand tied behind your back? Your strong black hand. I said, for once, let the black man get on his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket. And there will be no power on earth that can deny that he's earned the right to citizenship in the United States of America. And finally, old slow Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. I was in Boston, and I would not go through and tell you of that celebration that we had on January the 1st, 1863, but I will say that though I was somewhat disappointed with that proclamation, it did one thing. It opened the Union forces to African Americans. The black man could now fight for his own freedom. I was designated a recruiter for these men, and I bellowed, the trumpet has sounded. Men of color to arms. This is your golden opportunity. And let me tell you one thing, they came. Through the fields, through the woods, over hills and over mountains they came because they were tired of the women being abused like my mother was. Tired of little babies snatched out of their mother's arms and sold. Tired of being beaten and treated like beasts. They came, they enlisted, and they fought gallantly. Many of the promises that I had made them were not kept, and that led to a most interesting meeting at the White House. You see, I was there in a room filled with men, many, many men, and I was the only dark spot there. We filled out cards and sent them forward, stating why we wanted to have audience with the President of the United States. Some people never get to see him. Sometimes it takes a long time, just as it took me a long time to be allowed to speak today. But eventually, a man appeared at the top of the stairs and said, "The President wishes to see Frederick Douglass." I stood up and I felt big. You should have heard the clamor in the room. I said, I'm Frederick Douglass, out of my way. The president wishes to see me. I made my way to the stairs, and as I ascended, I thought about my humble upbringing. Grandmama Betsy, my mama. That dirt floor. I made it to the top of the stairs and was led to the doorway, and I looked in, and there sat Abraham Lincoln. Much as I thought he would be, he had one foot in this part of the room and the other foot way over in that part of the room. I approached the president, and he began to rise. I approached him to introduce myself. I suppose you want to know how he greeted a black man in the White House. I'll tell you this. He said, no need for introduction. Mr. Douglass, I know you. I've heard a lot about you. You said some things about me that weren't very nice. You said I was slow. Yes, sir, I did. You said I vacillate. Yes, sir, I did. You said I can't make my mind up. But Mr. Douglass, I am slow. But when I make my mind up, rarely do I change it. He reached out his hand, looked me squarely in the eye, and gave me a firm handshake. At that moment, I forgot all about my humble upbringing. Have a seat, Mr. Douglass, and have a cool drink of water. What can I do for you, Mr. Lincoln? I'm a free man. I'm not here for myself, but I'm here for those I represent. You see, thousands of my brave black men have joined the Union Army. I was told to promise them they would receive equal pay, equal rations, equal promotions and accommodations. None of these things have happened. And of most grave importance, Mr. Lincoln, my men are being captured and executed. And if you don't do something about this, you will be held as equally responsible by the civilized world as Jefferson Davis. He promised me that these things in time would be taken care of because the black man was still a despised man and he could not move too swiftly on these matters, but they would change. I left that meeting thinking one thing: Abraham Lincoln was, as they had said he was, an honest man. We had many subsequent meetings and perhaps became friends. But the war ended. The North was victorious and the South, with all of its great generals, was defeated, laying like a severed snake waiting to die. The South was defeated, never to rise again. But we should never take for granted the freedom that we have today, or the price that was paid for that freedom. 40,000 of those 200,000 brave black men that enlisted died. But more tragically, my friend was assassinated. Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president. The Union meant more to him than did our freedom or our liberty. But if it was not for his wise and beneficent rule, we would not have been lifted from the depths of slavery to the heights of liberty and manhood. Our men would not have been able to discard the rags of slavery and don the Union blue. Had Abraham Lincoln lived to be the ripe old age that his temperate habits gave promise, had the curtain of death come down, but slowly. Had he lived to see the end of his great works, we still would have mourned him greatly. But you see, he was taken away without warning, killed by the red hand of an assassin, not because he was hated. For if anyone ever knew Abraham Lincoln as I knew him, he could never hate him. He was killed because of what he believed in and what he did for my people and for freedom and liberty in this country and as an example throughout the world. And his memory will be precious to us always. People, the war is over. I went to visit my old slave master. Warned not to do so, I did so, and I walked in the doorway and looked in. The old man was on his deathbed. And after all those years, he recognized me. Come in, Marshal Douglass. I was a United States Marshal in Washington, D.C. He motioned for me to sit down beside his deathbed, and he reached out his bony hand, and I grasped it. Tears rolled down his cheek, and I became somewhat choked up myself. I said, "Captain, what did you think of me running away all those years ago?" He said, "Frederick, I knew you were too smart to remain a slave, and if I were you, I would have done the same thing." I said, "Captain, at one time I hated you enough to kill you, but I forgave you because I realized that you and I were both victims of our own time. I was born a slave. You were born amongst a family of slave owners. Neither one of us had a choice in that matter, and I forgive you." I turned to leave, and he said, "Wait, please. I heard you were angry with me because when your grandmother Betsy became too old and feeble to be of any use, I sent her out in the woods to die." Yes. He said, "Frederick, I did not do that. My brother did that. And when I heard of it, I sent for Betsy and I had her brought to my home where she lived, and we took care of her for the rest of her life. I suppose in my own way I thanked him and left. A few days later, I was reading the newspaper and saw where the old man had died. At the very end of his obituary, read these words: "Captain Thomas All, of all the accomplishments of his life, perhaps this was the highest. He once owned the great Frederick Douglass." Thank you.
I think we see, ladies and gentlemen, why he was called the Lion of Washington. A most eloquent man and a most heartfelt speech, and we thank you for that. His eloquence makes me think of one thing that I'll share quickly before we go to our next slide. Another great orator, that John Randolph of Roanoke that we started out with, said that the most eloquent speech he ever heard was a slave mother on the auction block pleading that her child not be sold from her. and that was sheer elegance at that point. Thank you, Mr. Douglass, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, if we will go this way, we will go down to the Confederate Memorial site.